growth and origins of the Hasidic movement. And I mentioned that the phenomenal rise and success of Hasidut did not come without some opposition. So we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. It's always somewhat interesting how movements get their name. So, for example, Hasidut is a name which it doesn't originate in the 18th century with the Baal Shem Tov. Hasidut, the Hasidim, the Mishnah already talks about the Hasidim Harishonim, the original Hasidim. And then there was a medieval movement that predates what we colloquially call Hasidut, called the Hasidei Ashkenaz. So this was a name which was around for quite some time before it became appropriated by what we call the Hasidic movement. But it was a name that meant the pious ones, the righteous ones. Hasidut from the same shoresh as chesed, kindness. The opponents of Hasidut became termed the MITNAGDIM, from the shoresh neged, to oppose. Very often, even though the MITNAGDIM, the opponents of Hasidut, were the status quo group that predated them. They were the group from which the Hasidim broke away. When you're the only group in town, you usually don't need a name, and very often your name becomes an appellation given to you, sometimes by the opposing group. I hope that we'll see in a few weeks, even the name Orthodoxy, is a name that's given to us, to the Orthodox community, not one that we choose. It's an appellation that's given to us by the Reform movement, and it's almost done somewhat tongue-in-cheek. So what a group is called is not always the term of their own choosing. The MITNAGDIM, actually in the early generations referred to the Hasidim as the Kat, the group or the sect. Here, let's put that up on the board. There you go. Kat, the sect, the sectarian group, the Hasidim. And as a matter of fact, this figure that you see on the board, the Vilna Gaon, the great leader of the anti-Hasidic movement, the leader of the MITNAGDIM, he himself in his lifetime was known as the Hasid. In other words, he was called by his students and followers the Hasid, and until that term became appropriated by the group to which he was opposing. So you see that these titles and terms and names of movements are slippery and confusing things. The Gaon, the Gra, Rabbi Eliyahu ben Shlomo Zalman Zecher Tzadik Levracha. The Gra, he's sometimes called, an acronym for Gaon Rabbeinu Eliyahu. He's also called the Gaon Mivilna, or the Vilna Gaon. Lives from 1720 to 1779 in Vilna, which is today in Lithuania. Vilnius, it's called. If you ever have occasion to visit the Baltic states, you can go to the famous cemetery in Vilna and visit the kever of the Gra, of the Vilna Gaon, which was refurbished at some point in the last number of years, I think, or last couple of decades. The Gaon, the Vilna Gaon, again, a title which is confusing. The Vilna Gaon was not, technically speaking, a Gaon. The Gaonim, with a capital G, was a name given, a title actually given to the leaders of Rabbinic Judaism in Bavel, in Babylonia, in the 10th, 11th centuries. Sadia Gaon, a name that you may be familiar with, Rav Hai Gaon, a name you might be familiar with. They were the Gaonim. They were the leaders of Rabbinic Judaism in the post-Talmudic era. After the conclusion of the Talmud, the center of Torah study was in Bavel, in what's today Iraq, actually. And the leaders of the yeshivot and the leaders of Jewish learning, the center of Jewish learning there in Bavel, was led by the Geonim. It was a title. I mean, the word literally probably means splendor, or it's a recognition of the genius of the people that held the office. When 800, 700 years later, the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Eliyahu, is called the Gaon. It's in quotation marks. It's as if to say that he was on the stature of those great ones that came before him. But when we talk about the Gaonim, or the Gaonic period, technically speaking, his title is in quotation marks. That's the Vilna Gaon. But the fact that he's called a Gaon is an indicator that he was head and shoulders above and unlike and distinct from any of his contemporaries, and that his genius is more reminiscent of the Gaonim and the Rishonim. Some interesting facts about the Gaon. He never held any type of official position in the community, in a school, in a yeshiva, in an institution. He was always a private individual. He was always a private citizen who was recognized for his genius, and around whom followers and students flocked, but not because of any official position that he held. He was said to be intensely private, but he gains this reputation for brilliance and for piety. His main accomplishment, as we'll see, is the restoration of the role of the Talmid Chacham, of the conventional, traditional Torah scholar, to primacy in Jewish life. After the events that we've been talking about, after the pogroms of 1648 and 1649, after Shabtai Tzvi, after all these events, the conventional scholarly version of Judaism is less appealing to the unlearned, the downtrodden masses. That Chassidut is very appealing to. These people become the foot soldiers of the Hasidic movement. But yet the Gaon and his followers are able to stabilize the conventional model, as it were, and that becomes the basis for the modern yeshiva system and for its outgrowth, the Musar movement, which we'll talk about. Let me just check the chats here. Chaim says that MITNAGDIM is a derogatory term. It's not so much derogatory in that it just says that they are the opponents of Chassidut. It's a little ironic because the MITNAGDIM were the majority, they were the mainstream, and the Hasidim came and kind of break away from the mainstream, and suddenly the MITNAGDIM become the opponents. They're the home team. The MITNAGDIM are the home team. They're not opposing anything. They're upholding the status quo. And technically speaking, it's the Hasidim that are opposing the way things always had been and are calling for some type of innovation. So if anything, it's an ironic term. The term orthodoxy, on the other hand, which again we'll talk about, or the term orthodoxy itself is, Tzila points out, it's from Greek, which it literally means correct belief. Doxy from the same shorish as doctrine. correct doctrines, as if to say, the Reform said about the traditional community, oh, they think that they have the correct way to think and believe. What did the Gra do for Parnassa is a good question. We know that he was very, very poor. What did he do specifically for Parnassa? I'm not certain, but we can check it out. There's a very, very nice biography of the Vilna Gaon by Professor Etkes, E-T-K-E-S. I think that it's also available in English. And since Alan is not with us tonight, I'll ask somebody to check on Amazon and post the link if they find it. E-T-K-E-S. It would be something about the Vilna Gaon. It's an interesting comparison between the Vilna Gaon and the Baal Shem Tov. And the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov is slightly older than the Vilna Gaon, although they do overlap. They do overlap in their lifetimes, although they never meet. Neither the Gra nor the Baal Shem Tov, neither of them has any association with the traditional institutions of Jewish life, of communal life. In some ways, because of that, they both had greater impact, because they were viewed as, Klal Yisrael leaders and not merely the Rosh Yeshiva of this particular institution. They were leaders of the entirety of the Jewish people, not of any one synagogue or Beis Medrash or yeshiva or institution. They both of them, in different ways, both the Baal Shem Tov and the Gra are influenced by Kabbalah. The Gra, even though we think of him as this Litvak, Litvak is a term that we use. Litvak is a term that we use to mean, it means Lithuanian. There were of course, no, that doesn't make sense. You get that right? There were of course, Hasidim in Lithuania, and there were Litvaks, not technically speaking, but culturally speaking. There were of course Litvaks that lived outside of Lithuania. But a Litvak is the term that we use to describe the MITNAGDIM, the conventional, traditional, denizen of the Beis Medrash, of the yeshiva, not the warm, effusive chassid. The Litvak is the cold intellectual. Again, I'm portraying before you these kind of very gross stereotypes, which will become merged as the movements move along. But even though he's the arch Litvak, he's the Litvak's Litvak, the Baal Shem Tov himself was also a Kabbalist and was also deeply learned in Kabbalistic study. However, he felt very strongly that Kabbalah, that the mystical traditions and study should not be popularized, nor should it influence, at least overly influence, halachic rulings or normative practice. So even though he himself was learned in Kabbalah, he felt that it should occupy a certain kind of a niche within the Jewish world, and definitely not something that should be popularized. The Baal Shem Tov and Hasidut, in some ways, was an attempt to popularize Kabbalistic teachings. Many of the Hasidic rituals and practices are influenced by Kabbalah, and even there's a notion that the whole institution of the Hasidic story, this idea that we can encapsulate morals and teachings into the Hasidic tale, a type of folklore. There is one notion that at its heart, Hasidic folklore, Hasidic tales, Sipurei Ma'asiyot, Sipurei Hasidim, of both of tales of wonder of the Hasidic leaders, as well as a more type of abstract, pardon the expression, midrashic type of Hasidic tale that tries to encapsulate a message or a value that those were vessels to encapsulate Kabbalistic thought in a way that could be presented to the common folk. It was a kind of popularization of Kabbalistic thought, and there's been work on this topic trying to show how the Hasidic tale is a encapsulation of Kabbalistic thought. So again, the Baal Shem Tov and the Gra, neither associated with traditional institutions. Number two, both rooted in and influenced by Kabbalah. Both of them are, to certain degrees, messianic visionaries. Both of them have a notion of how it is and where it is that we the Jewish people are meant to get to. Both of them, interestingly, are both of them attempt to come on Aliyah. Both of them attempt to come to Israel, and neither of them make it. They both have these failed attempts at Aliyah. They both set out on Aliyah. Something happens along the way, and they return. They head back to where they came from, the Vilna Gaon to Vilna, and the Gra back to the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains. So there's really very interesting parallels in their lives, these two great mountains around which traditional Judaism orbit. These two great, that's a mixed metaphor, pardon the expression, these two stars, these lodestars around which the Jewish people orbit in Eastern Europe in the 18th century. But for all of their similarities, there are, of course, great differences. The Baal Shem Tov, this is a gross oversimplification, the Baal Shem Tov was concerned with the state of the individual Jew, and the Vilna Gaon was concerned with the state of Judaism as a whole. The revolution of Hasidut was a type of a social upheaval. It was a change in the structure of the leadership, and it led to a negative reaction. Again, the opponents of Hasidim, the MITNAGDIM, in the first phase of the opposition, which comes in April of 1772, the leadership in Vilna, the rabbinic leadership in Vilna, issues a cherem, a type of excommunication, which is signed by the Gra. It's signed by the Vilna Gaon, and it accuses the Hasidim, it accuses this sect of a number of different transgressions. It accuses them of being poresh min hatzibur, of separating themselves from the community because they would form their own shtibels, they would form their own prayer houses to daven in their own kind of ecstatic way. And this is problematic because, generally speaking, even though we're not so careful about it, we're not always so careful about it today, but there was a notion that the community should be united in one synagogue. They also, the Hasidim, perhaps to justify their need to have their own prayer houses, they had changed the nusach hatfilah, the davening that we daven. I think we mentioned this last time. I assume that most of us daven what's called nusach Ashkenaz. The Hasidim, even though they were also Ashkenazim, they davened what's called nusach Sfard, which was again influenced by the Ari, by the Arizal, the great Kabbalistic, the great 16th century Kabbalist, who had certain variances and changes in the text of the davening, and the Hasidim adopt that davening not just because of its blatant Kabbalistic influences, but also because by then having their own different custom in the text of prayer that justified their need to have their own prayer house. So this was another thing that the initial Cherem highlighted. Then altogether, the way they davened, it wasn't just the words they were saying, but they davened, they were shouting, there was dancing, there was acrobatics in prayer. Again, as we discussed last time, Chassidut put a whole different emphasis on the role of davening, on the role of prayer, of ecstatic prayer, which in many ways takes the place of the central role of Talmud Torah, of Torah study. Altogether, this Cherem kind of knocks them for their lack of acceptance of the traditional Torah authorities, of their certain kind of strange social behaviors, etc. Later Charomim, later decrees of excommunication, as it were, also highlight the fact that the Hasidim were not careful about the conventional Zmanei Tfilah. You know that there's a notion in Halakha that the prayers have to be recited by a certain hour of the morning, and the Hasidim thought that it was better to daven, better to sacrifice those ideal times and to daven later with greater intensity and greater concentration than to follow the strict letter of the law. And there was also this issue of knives, of shechita knives, the knife which is used for ritual slaughter, for shechita of animals. The Hasidim adopted a certain practice of polishing the knives in a certain way, of sharpening the knives in a certain way that was opposed by the MITNAGDIM. But this also was a deviation with halachic, not without halachic sources, but it was a kind of way of saying, well, the mainstream does shechita this way. I won't go into the finer details of the two different shitot. A super sharp knife is, of course, preferred, but if you over sharpen a knife, particularly in the ages before our stainless steel, if you over sharpen a knife, the blade becomes. So how do you sharpen a knife? You take a piece of metal and you sharpen it to a very sharp edge, but the more you sharpen it, the thinner the edge gets, which both makes it sharper, but also makes it more susceptible to becoming pagum, to becoming nicked, or somehow bent or chipped in such a way that the knife then becomes invalidated. So it's a type of stringency which leads to a leniency. I've oversimplified the issue, but that's essentially the way it works. But to say that we have a different practice in how shechita works means that we, the Hasidic community, we have to have our own shochtim. We need to have our own team of ritual slaughterers. Now this was necessary because in each town these were appointed and paid positions. And if the conventional team, the MITNAGDIM, had a monopoly on who got appointed to certain things, so the Hasidim now could say, well, we need to open up a parallel shop, as it were, and have our own team and have our own functionaries serving our community. Chaim asks, the other nusach was already established nusach for some. Were there any mixed communities with multiple shuls in vicinity with different nusach before this time? Excuse me. I'm not certain, but I think in the Ashkenazic communities, even if there was more than one synagogue, maybe because of space reasons, if you live in a particularly large town or shtetl, so then obviously you can't have only one synagogue. But the idea being that the entire community was davening the same thing. I think that was the point. These halachic changes that the Hasidim instituted were later justified and established by this great figure, who in many ways is the counter figure to the Gra, Rabbi Shner Zalman Miliadi Zatzal, the founder of Chabad Hasidut, also known as the Baal HaTanya, and also known as the Baal Shulchan Aruch Harav. You can even see in his picture. I mean, just compare this picture. I'm not sure of the provenance of these two pictures, but here's the Gra, and he looks like a Litvak. And here's the Shner Zalman. Here's the Baal HaTanya. He looks like a chassid. I don't know what's going on with his eyeballs there, but he definitely looks like he's in a moment, of ecstasy. So the Baal HaTanya, the founder of Chabad Hasidut. Hold on one second. Let me just get this picture back here. The Baal HaTanya, who lives from 1745 to 1812, writes a work called the Shulchan Aruch Harav. Obviously, the title is playing off of the Shulchan Aruch of Rav Yosef Karo. It's a halachic work of the first order, which also justifies the halachic practices, to show that the halachic practices of the Hasidim weren't mere deviationists, but were all within the halachic tradition writ large, even if they were not in line with the conventional approach of the general Eastern European MITNAGDIM community. All of the complaints against the Hasidim, can generally be. Pardon me, I'm just having some trouble here with this picture. All of the complaints against the Hasidim can generally be attributed to this de-emphasis of Torah study as the main road of Jewish expression. But the Haramim, the opposition to Hasidut, however, had probably an unexpected counter effect. It helped the Hasidim because the opposition from the MITNAGDIM, actually helped to unify all of the different Hasidic groups. Remember, we said last time that by the third generation of Hasidut, the leadership passes from the Baal Shem Tov to the Maggid of Mezrich, and then from the Maggid of Mezrich, partially for external, partially for internal, partially for ideological reasons, the leadership model of Hasidut moves to a decentralized model, where you have different Hasidic courts, local authority, led by local Hasidic rebbes, not all of whom necessarily saw eye to eye, not all of whom necessarily got along, and the opposition from the MITNAGDIM leads to a unification of the Hasidim, which strengthens them. It unites the different quarreling Hasidic groups. In 1798, the first Cherem again is in 1772. In 1798, which is quite a while afterwards, the Hasidim go to the Russian government to complain about the unfair treatment that they're getting at the hands of the organized Jewish community in Vilna. Now, Vilna at that point is part of Tsarist Russia, and the leadership of the Jewish community has authority based upon the charter the rights that it's given by the Russian government to maintain a certain type of autonomous control over the community. When the Hasidim go to the government to complain about how the Misnagdim are treating them, they make all different types of accusations, and yes, Tehillah Leah mentions a serious problem which comes to play on both sides, and neither side of this debate was innocent of these problems of going to the non-Jewish governments. They make accusations of financial improprieties and all different types of things. The government then, the Russian government then limits the power of the community. The Misnagdim make counter accusations against the Hasidim, in which they claim that the Hasidim were gathering money to send to the Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael, in Palestine, which they were. Jews were always collecting money to support the fledgling yishuv, the fledgling Jewish communities in Eretz Yisrael, but this was against the law in Russia. In Russia, it was against the law to send money abroad, and there are all these different types of accusations back and forth. And the Baal HaTanya, Reb Shneur Zalman, is arrested and questioned by the government. There's a tradition in Chabad. That the Baal HaTanya was questioned by none other than the Tsar himself. We're not sure that that's historically true. And the Baal HaTanya was released on the 19th of Kislev. The Hebrew date was the 19th of Kislev, and that is celebrated. Yud Tes Kislev is celebrated as a holiday by Chabad Hasidim until this very day. The battle and the conflict between the Hasidim and the Misnagdim go back and forth in the public sphere, but it slowly dies with the occasional flare-up from time to time, as on one hand, sooner or later the Misnagdim realize that the Hasidim are here to stay, and the early idea that we could really stamp them down is no longer plausible. And then ultimately there are enough common threats from the outside that the Hasidim and the Misnagdim realize that they have more to lose by being disunited than by being united. Among those outside threats are the waves of anti-Semitism, as well as from within the Haskalah, the European Enlightenment, which is no less threatening to the Hasidim than it is to the Misnagdim, and vice versa. And at a certain point, the Hasidim and the Misnagdim realize that they have bigger common enemies than the serious issues that divide them, and divide them really until today, although perhaps in different ways. And that's the tale of the initial conflict between the Hasidim and the Misnagdim. The Misnagdim, if last time we dedicated our attentions to Hasidim, the Misnagdim established certain institutions, and let me just say, I think I may have neglected to mention the Tanya, the Shneur Zalman, in addition to the Shulchan Aruch Harav, his great halachic work, he also writes a theological, philosophical work, the great work called the Tanya, which is studied by Hasidim everywhere, particularly beloved by Chabad Hasidim. If you Google it, you can get it online. Even there have been printings of Tanya has been printed virtually on every continent, in every city. They have this notion, they have this kind of portable printing press, this idea of the Tanya. But you can go online, you can find countless editions of the Tanya in every language. You can listen to shiurim on the Tanya. and it's worthy of study, and it's studied even by non-Hasidim and by non-Chamadnikim. It's worthy. It's a work that's worthy of our attention. But it is the first really thorough theological, philosophical work of Hasidut, and perhaps the greatest written work of Hasidut ever. Not perhaps, clearly the most significant Hasidic work, and really an everlasting addition to the Jewish bookshelf. It's one of the it's now considered one of the significant works of Jewish thought, be you Hasid or other. Sherry asks about the reconciliation. Was not really so much in the lifetime of the Gra. That was afterwards. The Haramim were never really revoked, but since they didn't really have any effect, there wasn't much need to have them revoked. Are there any English translations that are better than others? I'm not sure. There's one standard translation that was put out by Chabad. They have something called the Kahat Society, K-E-H-O-T. But if you go to the Chabad website, which is Chabad.org, C-H-A-B.org, you can there. I'm sure there's a link or a tab that takes you to Tanya, and you could see that online. Rav Steinsaltz has a very nice commentary on the Tanya, but it's available in Hebrew. He does have a couple of books in English that are about the Tanya, but they're not the text of the Tanya itself. I think one of them is called The Long Shorter Way. Joel mentions that there's a new translation of the Tanya in plain English with some Tanya commentary. If you can send us a link to that, that'd be great. And Sherry mentions that the first 3 volumes of Rav Steinsaltz's commentary are translated into English. I didn't know that, but that's great to know. So the MITNAGDIM, in an effort to bolster their position, they establish yeshivot. There were, of course, always yeshivot in the Eastern European world, but the most significant and historic of all yeshivot, the mother of all yeshivot, and the place that was called poetically by, I think, none other than Chaim Nachman Bialik, the great Hebrew poet and one-time student of Volozhin, called it the phrase escapes me, the Beit HaYotzer, the factory in which the Jewish people were formed, was the great Volozhin Yeshiva. This is a picture postcard from the early part of the 20th century of the yeshiva. What's remarkable about it is how small it looks. It wasn't a huge building. The building still stands, and it was in terrible disrepair for a number of years. And sometime not long ago, it was renovated, so the building literally wouldn't fall down. And these are more modern views of the building. And it's still there, and it's today in Belarus. It's not technically in Lithuania today. In 1772, again, the first partition of Poland, many Jews are annexed into Russia, and this changes focus historically away from Poland to Russia. And Russia has a certain agenda that Poland didn't have. Remember, we said last time that despite our notions of what a terrible place Poland was, because it was, after all, the home turf of much of the Holocaust. Throughout many centuries, Poland was a pretty good place for the Jews. The Russians were much more oppositional. They want to see assimilation. They want to see the Jews kind of taken out of the shtetl and modernized. We'll talk a little bit more about that hopefully in some subsequent sessions. But the rabbis are looking to revive the old ways. They want a revival of Talmud Torah and the prestige of learning. Even though Jews never stopped learning, it was a question of proportions, and it was a question of centralities. In the old system, in the conventional system of yeshivot, most yeshiva students are poor, and yeshivot are even poorer. So students would learn, and they had something called in Yiddish Essentag. Essentag were literally eating days. The community would pay for and support the yeshivot. The yeshivot were arms of the organized Jewish community, and they were therefore pretty run-down places. And the boys would be farmed out to eat with families in the town, because that was the only way to keep the operation going. Now, to be clear, when we talk about yeshivot and yeshiva boys, cheder was the equivalent of what we call elementary school, and may have gone up to bar mitzvah. Yeshiva was the equivalent of college. Not everybody went off to yeshiva. Only the really promising students, or families that were wealthy enough that they could afford to have a son who wasn't otherwise working or farming or milking the cow or learning a trade or what have you. Not everyone went on to higher Torah education. Certainly nobody went on to higher secular education. Certainly not in the 18th century. Only later, in the later 19th century, did people start seeking some avenue of higher general education, and then only very few. So who would go off to yeshiva would be the very promising students, and the community would support such a thing. In these yeshivot, it was very simple. They had probably very limited sets of books. It wasn't like we think today of a library of a yeshiva, or certainly of a university. Could be we have reports that in certain yeshivot there was only one full set of shas. There was only one full set of the Talmud, and because altogether learning had lost some of its prestige, it was harder to convince the communities to support the yeshivot. This changes with Reb Chaim Volozhiner. Reb Chaim of Volozhin, he's called. Reb Chaim Volozhiner was the most prominent student of the Gra, of the Vilna Gaon. And in 1802, he opens this yeshiva in Volozhin. And it's significant on a number of different planes. Number one, it's not in Vilna. It's out in the suburbs. It's cut off from, like 60 kilometers away from Vilna. It's cut off from the organized community. It's an independent institution. It's not part of the larger organized community. It's not dependent on the larger organized community, and it's not under the thumb of the larger organized community. It's outside the grips of the kahal, of the structure, both structurally and financially. And he raises money for it with a team of shluchim, of agents, of emissaries that travel throughout Europe and much later even to America, to raise money for the yeshiva. He writes a work called the Nefesh HaChaim. The Nefesh HaChaim is a ideological, philosophical, theological work in which, here's a section from it, which if we have a chance we'll look at tonight. The Nefesh HaChaim, it's always considered a good it's like a sign of elegance to somehow be able to work your name into the title of the book. So Chaim Volozhiner writes this book, the Nefesh HaChaim, which is a statement of the goals of Torah study. And it's a paean to this notion of Torah lishma, Torah for its own sake. And it sets out the idea of what role Torah study should serve, what it might do, and how to go about it, what's the right way to study Torah. He's not speaking pedagogically, he's speaking ideologically. There's a wonderful book by Rabbi Norman Lamb, the Rosh Yeshiva, the president, or the one-time president of Yeshiva University, called Torah Lishma. It's a book in English, although the title is Torah Lishma in Hebrew. It has some subtitle by Rabbi Norman Lamb, which is an analysis and a historical and a textual analysis of this important work by the Nefesh HaChaim. Since Torah Lishma is an attempt to study Torah for its own sake and not for some type of utilitarian purpose, not to become a rabbi per se, but to be a lamdin, to be a scholar. So therefore, that's going to have influence on the curriculum. Instead of just learning practical halacha, you're going to learn everything. You're going to learn the tractates that don't largely bear on contemporary practice, but might relate to things that are only connected to the times when the Beit HaMikdash was in function, etc., etc., etc. It's going to change the focus and the scope of what Torah study looks like. In Volozhin, there was a very intense schedule, which may have emanated from a theological, Kabbalistic perspective. Even the Nefesh HaChaim is laced with Kabbalah. It wouldn't be fair to call it a Kabbalistic work, but there are some prominent Kabbalistic notions. One of these is the notion that the entirety of the world is upheld because of Torah study. And that if there'd ever be a moment where no one in the world was studying Torah, the world would be returned to tohu vavohu, would be returned to the primordial soup of null and void before creation. And therefore, since it's the Torah study which sustains the world, we have to be careful that 24/7 there's Torah study going on. And in Volozhin they did this. They had mishmarot. They had, like you might have people standing guard against thieves or terrorists or something. They had people that were always on, covering a shift to make sure that the lights were always on in the base medrash, to make sure that somebody was always learning, because if 24/7, if there was any one moment during 24/7 that there was no Torah study, the world would cease to exist. And since Volozhin is the flagship of all yeshivot, they take it upon themselves to make sure that's happening. So the schedule, there are many very wonderful memoirs of students that passed through Volozhin that record what life was like. They start learning very, very early in the morning, sometimes 3 or 4 in the morning. At 8 o'clock in the morning, they daven shacharis and they have breakfast and a nap, because they've been up since 3 in the morning. They learn from, let's say, like 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. At 1 o'clock, they eat lunch. Then they might have another short break, and then starting from the afternoon, from like 3 or 4 in the afternoon, they learn until midnight. So if you do the math, they're learning like 15 hours a day. They're learning 15 hours a day in addition to davening, and a little bit of eating, and a very little bit of sleep. Bialik, who I mentioned earlier, the great Hebrew poet Bialik, who himself kind of left the traditional path, but had a great nostalgia, which was not without critique. Bialik, one of his most famous poems, perhaps his most famous poem, is called Hamatmid, or writing in English there. Hamatmid, the masmid, hasmoda or hatmada. I mean, in Volozhin they called it hasmoda. Is the trait of being tamid, of being constant, of being focused on your learning and dedicated to it, and always there. And this very lengthy epic poem describing life in the yeshiva, compares the yeshiva student to like a nail in the bench. That on the bench that you sat on in the Beis Medrash, there might have been a nail. That's the student. He's always there. He's stuck to it. He's consistent. He's dedicated. He's eternally, vigilantly committed to his Torah study. There are different ways to read the poem. One is to read it in a kind of nostalgic vein. Another way is to read it in a kind of satirical vein. But Bialik says that again that the yeshiva, that Volozhin was the place where the soul of the Jewish people, where the nation was formed. And Volozhin has influences on other yeshivot, even outside of Eastern Europe, in Eretz Yisrael and in the United States. The yeshiva goes on. It's led much later. Again, it's founded by Reb Chaim Volozhiner in 1802. The height comes under the Netziv, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. Yes, Bialik did learn in Volozhin when he was a youth. The Netziv, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, was Rosh Yeshiva. He dies the Netziv dies in 1892. In the 1880s, when Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, the grandfather of Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, who we colloquially call the Rav, his grandfather was a leader of the yeshiva together with the Netziv, and in the 1880s there were probably around 400 students there. But things got a little difficult, and the Russian government began to get involved as part of their aggressive attempt to modernize the Jews, to assimilate the Jews, to secularize the Jews. There were demands that the yeshiva start teaching secular studies, which was obviously problematic for the traditional community. The yeshiva was closed for a short period in 1879 to 1881. In 1892, the Tsar ordered that it be closed specifically over the secular studies issue. It's reopened from 1895 to 1939, to the eve of World War II, but it's weaker, and it never fully recovers the splendor that it once had. That's the yeshiva of Volozhin. I'll just make one more comment. We're not going to get a chance to read this passage from the Nefesh Chaim tonight. The Musar movement, we talk about Hasidim and MITNAGDIM, the Hasidim and their opponents, but a branch of this conflict is also the Musar movement. The Musar movement is a stream within the Litvish community. It's a stream within the conventional MITNAGDIM, led by Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who lives from 1810 to 1883. He's a generation, beyond beyond the Balatanya, beyond maybe even 2 generations, beyond the Gra. The Gra again dies in 1779, and the Rabbi Yisrael Salanter is born only in 1810. He founds the Musar movement. The Musar movement was a corrective within the Misnagdic community that is an attempt to imbue ethics and attention to personal development and personal growth within the traditional learning curriculum. There are two styles of Musar that develop after Yisrael, called after the names of the cities in which the yeshivot were founded. One is Navardik and one is Slabotka. And they have, again, a gross oversimplification and stereotype, but they're different types of Musar. They're different types of kind of ethical study. One is an attempt to build up the student, to encourage him to reach greatness because he is great. That's the style known as the Navardik school of Musar. And the Slabotka school of Musar is an attempt to, frankly, to tear down the student, to show him that he's really garnished, that he's not worth very much, and therefore he needs to work doubly hard to improve himself. There are a number of unique characteristics to the Musar yeshivot. One is the presence of a figure called the mashgiach, not the person that's in charge to make sure that the food is kosher, but there to make sure that the pupils are kosher. The person that's there as a kind of parallel to the conventional Rosh Yeshiva. The Rosh Yeshiva is there in light of his scholarship, and the Mashgiach is there in light of the strength of his personality to push the agenda of the Musar Yeshiva, and is there to exhortate the students towards the type of personal growth that the Musar Yeshiva has set on its agenda. Now, in 30 seconds, I tried to describe the Musar movement, which is probably, it was probably usher for me to do that, to try to summarize something so profound and complex in such a short amount of time. But I mention it here only as a sense that the critique that Hasidut launches on conventional learning does not go unheard or unheeded. And the conventional community itself makes corrections and movements. Not everybody buys into the Musar movement, but it is an attempt to act as a corrective on the conventional community of traditional learning, to put a different emphasis, not the same emphasis that the Hasidim were coming to place, but to show that the whole thing is really quite flexible. Ultimately, all religious Jews of all stripes will unite in the face of the different threats from throughout and from within, but each of them maintains their own integrity. It's true that today Hasidim and MITNAGDIM will get married, although sometimes that causes more or less of a conflict in a family. In the days of old, this was not the case. A few times I've mentioned some of the wonderful stories by Shai Agnon. It happens that tomorrow is Shai Agnon's 40th yahrzeit, so I'll just mention that this is a theme that runs throughout a number of his stories, if you know them. If you know the story Hanidach, or the story Tehillah, which is, if you've read any Agnon, so Tehillah was probably on that syllabus. These are all stories set in his old hometown, the Galician town of Buchach, which he sometimes satirically calls shibush. These are all stories that have as their plot device the conflict between Hasidim and Misnagdim, and which was sometimes viewed as a fight literally in some of the cases, a fight to the death. And the idea that a Chosid and a Misnagid would marry their children together is just unbelievable. These are things that over which personal wars were fought. So you see these notions echo throughout, even throughout the kind of literature of the time, or literature that was trying to portray what life in those times were like. And this isn't in the early days of Hasidim and Misnagdim. These are this is much later. These are portraying scenes that happened already at the end of the 19th century, maybe the mid-19th century. So you see the conflict is still there, even if the community can unite for various institutional purposes. On a personal level, there was certainly each community was able to maintain its own distance and its own integrity while coming together for the important work of keeping Klal Yisrael together. So that's our very quick summary of the counterbalance to the Hasidic movement, to understand the movement that the Hasidim were moving away from, and we will continue next week. If you have any questions, I'll stay on. And Freilichen Purim, Happy Purim, Shabbat Shalom, and all of those good things.